In this lecture module, we'll turn our attention away from background and contextual issues and start talking about the issues that dominate the philosophy of religion. We'll begin by discussing the tripartite essential nature of this worshipful monotheistic deity. Then we'll turn our attention to a priori arguments for atheism. And these arguments all turn on the idea that there's a conceptual incoherence in the very concept of this deity. So we'll first look at what's sometimes called the paradox of omnipotence, and then we'll turn our attention to the Euthyphro dilemma. After looking at a priori arguments for atheism, we'll then turn our attention to a posteriori empirical arguments for atheism. So arguments that have a component of empirical data or observation evidence as a premise. So we'll start off with what's called the problem of evil or suffering argument, and then we'll turn to a sort of general criticism that religious suppositions lack explanatory power or fail to explain important features of the world that we have come to observe. So across the canons of the Judeo-Christian monotheistic doctrine, it's come to be a pretty common understanding that God's nature has to include three important superlative properties. So for instance, St. Augustine understands God's nature in terms of these properties. These three properties, it's claimed, prove necessary for a God to fulfill the role of creator of the universe and source of moral authority, as well as being deserving of worship as opposed to defiance or contempt. So the first property, God must be omnipotent, having unlimited power. Now this is considered to be indispensable because God is supposed to be the creator of all things, and therefore God must have the power to do anything so that God can create and destroy the world, the universe, and so on. The second property is that God is omniscient, having unlimited knowledge. And this is important for various reasons, but the most obvious is you don't really want a superlatively powerful being who is, relatively speaking, an idiot, who doesn't know how the consequences of his or her or its actions are going to turn out, or what people are doing, etc. Right? And the third property is God's omnibenevolence. That is, God exhibits unlimited beneficence and love. And this, again, is the idea that a worshipful God would be a God that is superlatively caring and deserving of worship, of adoration, as opposed to a malevolent God who might be deserving of contempt or rebellion. So together, these three powers, or properties, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, are considered to be core properties, essential properties that a monotheistic God would have to have in order to be worshipful, in order to be the source of moral authority, and in order to be the creator of the universe. Now, the three major positions within philosophy of religion can be looked at as follows. Theism, which asserts that God exists and has the properties associated with the Judeo-Christian God, particularly those three core properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. Atheism, which says that the God envisioned by this Judeo-Christian tradition doesn't exist, that there's no reason to suppose that God exists at all, and in fact we have positive reasons to suppose that God does not exist. And then finally, a position that was advocated by Susan B. Anthony, for instance, agnosticism. And agnosticism differs from atheism and theism because it's a skeptical claim. Essentially, agnosticism claims that it's not possible to form a rational belief concerning such a God's existence or non-existence, and so it essentially adopts a principle of withholding assent with regard to the existence of God. Now, interestingly enough, there are arguments for theism and arguments for atheism, but arguments for agnosticism tend to essentially look at the other arguments and say, looks like a draw to me. So there aren't a lot of positive arguments in favor of agnosticism as opposed to atheism or theism.